The night of August 20th, 1989, seemed ordinary in Beverly Hills, but inside a 23-room mansion on Elm Drive, something terrible was about to happen. The mansion, valued at $4 million, had previously been used by celebrities like Prince and Elton John, but that night, it belonged to a couple who never could have imagined the horror about to unfold within its walls. Richard and Catherine Whitmore, a successful couple in the business world, were relaxing in the living room. The VCR played a James Bond thriller while the couple dozed off on the sofa. The mansion, usually alive with the comings and goings of business and high society, was that night sunk in silence. Outside, the street seemed calm, but that calm was deceiving. Around 10 p.m., a local teenage girl was standing on the sidewalk, waiting for her boyfriend, when she noticed a vehicle pull up with two men inside. They parked in front of the mansion and got out. One of them walked toward the trunk, while the other headed for the house. The girl watched for a moment, but saw nothing unusual. Not recognizing the men, she looked away. In that instant, without knowing it, she had just witnessed the beginning of a massacre. The Whitmore mansion was protected by a sophisticated security system and tall iron gates. That night, though, the gates were open and the alarm was off. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm your host, and welcome to another episode of Lost Bones. Today we're going to walk through the events that turned the Whitmore family home into one of the most brutal crime scenes in American history, and turned their name into a symbol of horror that still shocks the United States to this day. Around 11:47 p.m., the Beverly Hills Police Department received an emergency call. On the line, a man told the dispatcher that his parents had been shot and killed. A patrol car was immediately sent to the residence at 722 Elm Drive. On scene, officers Michael Barton and John Carlisle found an imposing mansion. They walked cautiously around the grounds to get a sense of the situation, but were startled by screams coming from the front door. Moments later, two young men came running out of the house together, rushed past the officers, and dropped to their knees on the lawn by the sidewalk. The officers tried to talk to the young men. The younger one stood up and ran toward a tree. The older one tried to grab him, but both were clearly in shock. Michael and John went into the house and found, in the living room, the bodies of a middle-aged man and woman. They would later be identified as Richard and Catherine Whitmore. With the house sealed off, the case was handed to investigator Lee Sorensen, 38, one of the most respected detectives on the force. Upon arrival, Lee inspected the scene and noticed nothing had been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry, unusual for a high-end home like this. The absence of a break-in suggested the killers hadn't met any resistance getting inside. In the living room, Lee found furniture and objects out of place. However, there were no signs of a struggle. The bodies showed clear signs of an execution, with no chance to defend themselves. To Lee, the disorder in the room seemed deliberate, staged. The conclusion was straightforward. Richard and Catherine likely knew whoever had killed them. The two young men seen fleeing the house were identified as the couple's sons, Nathaniel and Edward Whitmore, 21 and 19 years old. Both were taken to the police station to give statements to Supervisor and Sergeant Thomas Edwards. Edward was shaken, sobbing, barely able to answer questions. Nathaniel, on the other hand, was calm and walked the sergeant through the day's events. "We played tennis that morning," Nathaniel said, "in the backyard court. Then we watched a match on TV. After lunch, the two had gone to the mall and spent the afternoon shopping until around 5 p.m. Later, they'd tried to catch a movie, License to Kill, but gave up because of long lines, opting instead to see the new Batman film. After the movie, they headed toward the Taste of LA food festival in Santa Monica. Not knowing exactly how to get there, they called a friend, Perry Wexler, who was already at the event. The three agreed to meet up afterward at the Cheesecake Factory in Beverly Hills. But before that, Edward realized he'd forgotten his fake ID, so the brothers decided to head back home first. When we got back, Nathaniel told the horror on, "Sergeant, there was smoke in the living room. Weird smoke. I thought about my mom right away. She hadn't been doing well lately. Sergeant Thomas listened carefully to the account, which was later confirmed by Edward. Toward the end of the interview, Thomas asked whether Nathaniel knew anyone who hated his parents enough to kill them. Maybe the local mob, Nathaniel suggested. I don't know. Maybe. Despite the brothers' odd behavior, Thomas didn't consider them suspects right away. On top of that, no gunshot residue test was performed to check whether either of them had recently fired a weapon. That kind of test was common practice across the United States. But at the time, Beverly Hills investigators didn't run it routinely. It was only administered if specifically requested by the lead detective on the case, which didn't happen here. In the days that followed, forensic examiners continued going over the residence. At the same time, at the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's office, Dr. Ellis Golden performed the autopsies. In Richard Whitmore's report, the doctor noted that the shot to the back of the head had been fired with a shotgun. The wound was so large it could have fit an adult's fist inside. The brain had been almost completely destroyed. Despite the apparent execution-style killing, Richard also showed severe fractures to the face and jaw. Other shotgun wounds were found on the right arm below the shoulder, the right forearm, the left knee, and the left elbow. That last wound caught the medical examiner's attention. He suspected the first shot may have been fired while Richard was walking toward the shooter. Though it was difficult to determine the exact sequence of shots, Dr. Ellis concluded the fatal headshot had been the last one fired, occurring while the victim was still moving because of his earlier wounds. Catherine Whitmore's autopsy, meanwhile, revealed even more severe damage. She had been struck in the left cheek, a shot that fractured her jaw, destroyed teeth, damaged her tongue, and tore a large hole in her face. Her right thumb was nearly severed, suggesting she had raised her hand in a defensive reflex against the gun. Other wounds were found on her right forearm, left chest, and left leg, which had 3 separate perforations. One of the shots destroyed her skull and brain entirely. During the analysis, the medical examiner found traces of buckshot in Catherine's wounds, something absent from Richard's wounds. The most likely theory was that the killers had reloaded the shotguns with different ammunition, perhaps without even realizing it. That theory gained strength when they found a strange wound on Catherine's left knee, caused by a shot fired front to back. The unusual angle suggested the attacker wanted to inflict very specific damage, simulating a kind of planned execution. That staging, according to investigators and Dr. Ellis, may have been done deliberately to make the crime look like a mob hit. That raised a crucial question. Did Richard and Catherine actually have ties to organized crime? To find out, investigators began digging into the couple's full history. Richard Whitmore was born in Cuba into an upper-middle-class family. His father had been a well-known soccer player and owner of an accounting firm. His mother, a talented swimmer, had been inducted into a Cuban Athletes' Hall of Fame. As the youngest of his siblings, and living in a privileged social position, Richard was thoroughly spoiled by his parents. Even so, he grew up in a turbulent social climate. Between 1959 and 1960, Cuba went through a revolution that removed Fulgencio Batista from power and brought Fidel Castro to lead the country. That triggered drastic economic changes. Wealthy families lost their properties, confiscated by the new regime. Farms were converted into collective land, and the poorer population struggled against rising prices. At 16, Richard was sent with a relative to the United States, while his parents arranged to flee separately. The goal was to protect him from the uncertainties of the new government. He arrived in Pennsylvania and faced financial hardship and a language barrier. Even so, he threw himself into his studies and looked for ways to earn money. One of his biggest dreams was to attend an Ivy League university, the group of the most prestigious institutions in the United States, even though it seemed like a distant goal. After a great deal of effort, he earned a spot at Southern Illinois University. During his time there, he met Catherine Sinclair, who worked in the school's broadcasting department. Catherine had a difficult childhood, marked by violence and infidelity from her father toward her mother. Those experiences made her a withdrawn, depressive young woman, even though she was considered attractive by her peers. Struggling to express herself, she buried herself in her studies. In 1962, she met Richard, and the two quickly discovered they shared the same drive to achieve success in life. According to friends, the couple drew attention on campus throughout the 1960s. Richard's Cuban background stood in contrast with Catherine's all-American appearance, at a time when mixing different backgrounds was still not widely accepted. Even though the civil rights movement was gaining momentum elsewhere in the country, in Illinois, segregation was still very much present. Even so, Richard and Catherine ignored the prejudice and stayed together. Both families, however, didn't take the relationship well. Catherine's parents questioned her fiancé's foreign background. Richard's relatives, who had already settled in the United States, criticized the fact that Catherine's parents were divorced and considered Richard too young to marry. Faced with resistance from both families, the couple eloped in 1963. Shortly after Catherine finished her degree in communications, they got married in another city and later moved to New York, where Richard's relatives lived. In the years that followed, Richard and Catherine focused on their studies and building their careers. Catherine had dreamed of working in broadcasting, but set that plan aside to support her husband's growing business career. In 1967, Richard graduated from Queens College and was hired by Coopers & Lybrand, an international accounting firm. Catherine, meanwhile, became a teacher at an elementary school in New York. During this period, the couple had their first son, Nathaniel Whitmore. 2 years later, during a meeting with Lion Container, a client of Coopers & Lybrand, Richard made a strong impression and was offered a management position at the company, based in Hinsdale, Illinois. With his career advancing, Richard moved the family to the new state, and Catherine began devoting herself entirely to raising their son. By 1970, Richard had already risen to the presidency of Lion Container, but his time in the role was brief. A conflict with the chairman of the board led to his dismissal. The following year, he took an executive position at Hertz, which prompted another move, this time to New Jersey, where Edward, the couple's second son, was born. Ambitious as ever, Richard was promoted to chief financial officer in 1973, and at 35, became the company's worldwide general manager. Over time, he became known for treating his subordinates with a heavy hand. In 1980, he lost ground at Hertz and was transferred to RCA's entertainment division. At RCA, he took over management of the record label, which was struggling due to declining artist contracts. Richard tried to turn things around by signing bands like Eurythmics and Jefferson Starship. However, he adopted controversial practices, such as inflating sales figures by shipping excessive quantities of albums to stores. Those tactics led to major losses. In 1986, the company took a $25 million hit from returned albums. Despite that, Richard was promoted in 1985 to Executive Vice President and Director of Worldwide Operations for RCA Records. The company still remained one of the largest video distributors in the United States. Though he excelled professionally, his behavior as a husband left a lot to be desired. Richard made decisions without consulting Catherine, who let him act however he pleased. That freedom led to affairs with several different women. In the past, he'd been involved with a confident businesswoman from Manhattan named Louise, a dark-haired woman. Catherine took a while to suspect her husband's behavior until she discovered another affair and decided to leave the house. Richard convinced her to come back, likely out of concern for the well-being of their sons, Edward and Nathaniel. Catherine knew all too well what it was like to grow up in a home marked by betrayal. In 1986, Richard decided to come clean about his relationship with Louise, along with other affairs he'd kept secret. The confession stirred up painful memories for Catherine and triggered a depressive episode, during which she reportedly mentioned suicidal thoughts. The couple's life was collapsing, Catherine dealing with emotional turmoil, while Richard, an absent and unfaithful husband, watched his career at RCA edging toward its end. Even amid these personal struggles, Richard received an offer to become president of Cinema Global Entertainment, a production company known for the Blackwater action film franchise. Ignoring the family crisis, Richard moved his wife and sons to the West Coast, settling in Calabasas, an upper-middle-class suburb in the northwest corner of the San Fernando Valley, near Beverly Hills. He saw the new position as a chance for a fresh start. Catherine, on the other hand, didn't welcome the move with any enthusiasm. Still struggling with depression, she preferred the other house the couple had once owned, located outside California. Only Edward moved with his parents. Nathaniel stayed behind, at Princeton for college, but visited Calabasas frequently. The new job seemed promising. In December 1991, Richard was recognized by the company and received a life insurance policy worth $15 million. The Whitmore family was also included in a second policy, valued at $5 million. Despite his authoritarian manner and difficult personality, Richard had accumulated significant wealth over the course of his career. Investigators concluded that, overall, Richard didn't have any real enemies. His mistresses showed no apparent motive to want the executive dead. However, one unusual financial pattern caught their attention. After Richard and Catherine's deaths, the family's money began being managed by the new beneficiaries of the fortune, their sons, Edward and Nathaniel Whitmore. On August 25, 1989, the Whitmore brothers organized their parents' memorial in Los Angeles. During the ceremony, they reconnected with influential figures from the business world their parents had moved in. The two arrived nearly an hour late. Edward appeared deeply uncomfortable, his face swollen and red. Nathaniel, on the other hand, seemed calm, determined to project the image that he would step into his father's shoes as the new head of the family. Up to that point, guests had only known Nathaniel through the stories Richard used to tell, praising his son's acceptance into Princeton and his growing involvement in the family business. That acceptance came naturally, marking a symbolic transfer of leadership to Nathaniel, who founded Whitmore Investment Enterprises, a small company under his own direction. 3 days later, the brothers held a memorial service in the chapel at Princeton University. Nathaniel gave a moving eulogy, nearly half an hour long, sharing memories and lessons learned from his parents. Edward stayed silent throughout. In the days that followed, people close to the family noticed very different postures in the two brothers. Nathaniel, the older one, seemed focused on building a career in the corporate world, following in his father's footsteps. Edward, meanwhile, was torn between starting college or pursuing a career in tennis, the sport he loved most. Meanwhile, the Beverly Hills Police Department intensified its investigation. Detectives Lee Sorensen and Tim Callahan were leading the case. In a short time, investigators had gathered several suspicions and theories. Multiple statements began describing Richard as a far harsher man than most people realized. To many, he came across as an authoritarian, feared boss, which raised the possibility of a hit ordered by former employees or business partners. But Lee Sorensen was caught off guard during a conversation with Peter and Karen Weaver, close friends of the Whitmores. When questioned, Peter admitted he wasn't certain what had happened, but revealed he was starting to suspect Nathaniel and Edward. "Why do you think that?" the investigator asked. Peter explained that the brothers had always seemed too good, too polite, somehow off. According to him, something about them just didn't add up. That comment intrigued Lee, who decided to open an investigation focused directly on the couple's sons. Quickly, the group of detectives noticed a pattern of suspicious spending. After their parents' deaths, Edward and Nathaniel started throwing money around. They bought cars, a gunmetal gray Porsche 911 Carrera and a Jeep Wrangler, along with clothes and jewelry. Within just a few days of the crime, they'd already spent more than $15,000 on Rolex watches and other luxury items. At the time of his death, Richard held 300,000 shares of Cinema Global Entertainment, each valued at $20. Beyond the shares, the family's assets included real estate, vehicles, and valuable personal belongings. The estate left behind by Richard and Catherine was valued at $14 million. After taxes and debts were deducted, Nathaniel and Edward each received roughly $2 million. Close friends told investigators the brothers were frustrated with that amount. Though $2 million was a substantial sum, both had expected far more and believed Richard had hidden part of the family fortune in Swiss bank accounts. Executives from Cinema Global Entertainment were also questioned. They reported that Nathaniel and Edward were visibly disappointed to learn they wouldn't have access to Richard's life insurance payout since he'd never completed the required medical exam. Even so, the company agreed to cover part of the brothers' expenses since they claimed they no longer felt safe in the Beverly Hills mansion, insisting the mobsters responsible for the murders might come back to kill them too. As a result, they began hopping between luxury hotels. It was later discovered that Cinema Global Entertainment had covered about $8,800 in lodging expenses. On top of that, the company paid for bodyguards hired by the brothers, as well as a rented limousine. Those bodyguards later reported odd behavior from Nathaniel, who at one point jumped out of the moving limousine to buy random items he'd spotted on the street. On another occasion, he spent $24,000 on sound equipment. Eventually, the bodyguards were let go. When questioned about it, Nathaniel claimed an uncle from New Jersey had reached out to the mob and secured some kind of peace agreement. The man in question was middle-aged, with no known ties to organized crime, which only deepened investigators' doubts. The information only heightened the police's suspicion. After cycling through several hotels, the brothers rented apartments in Marina del Rey. Nathaniel's cost $2,150 a month, and Edward's $2,150. Shortly after, they put in an application for a penthouse valued at $990,000, but the financing was denied. Even so, the spending continued across California. In October 1989, Nathaniel used one of Richard's credit cards to rack up $90,000 in purchases. Around this time, he also took several flights, claiming he was involved in business negotiations. At one point, Nathaniel decided to install friends as directors of Whitmore Investment Enterprises. He rented office space in a Princeton shopping center and bought new cars, but not a single employee ever actually worked there. Investigators soon realized the company never got off the ground. The so-called directors were students with no business experience, most of whom Nathaniel had only known for a few months. In the eyes of the police, Nathaniel was simply play-acting the role of businessman, dressing the part of an experienced investor without any of the substance. Curiously, Nathaniel attempted to buy a pizza place called Tony's Pizza in Princeton, but the owner turned him down. He then bought a diner instead, called Chuck's Spring, known for its spicy chicken wings. According to the former owner, the deal was absurd. Nathaniel paid $550,000 for a business worth only $200,000. Relatives thought Nathaniel seemed lost, but viewed the purchase as a possible way to give the young man some sense of direction. Nathaniel started working at the diner himself, extended the delivery hours, and changed the name to Mr. Buffalo's. The name change drew criticism from local business owners, since Chuck's had been a well-known, established brand. His family's concern grew when, shortly after the change, Nathaniel expressed a desire to open new locations, one in the mall, one on the university campus, and another in New Jersey. Later, he even talked about opening a second Mr. Buffalo's, even though the first one still wasn't turning a profit. In practice, Nathaniel was only piling up losses, the exact same thing happening with Edward. According to sources, the younger brother invested $40,000 to sponsor a rock concert at the Hollywood Palladium in Los Angeles. The person running the event vanished with the money. After getting scammed, Edward abandoned business ventures altogether and decided to focus entirely on tennis. He hired a private coach, paying him $60,000 a year. The brothers began traveling frequently and spending heavily. That pattern caught the attention of investigators, who began seriously considering the possibility that Edward and Nathaniel had been involved in their parents' murder. The suspicion gained real weight when Glenn Foster, a friend of Nathaniel's, revealed that the young man had hired two computer specialists to erase files from his personal computer. One of the technicians confirmed he'd been hired specifically to permanently delete data from the machine. On October 24th, Detective Lee Sorensen interviewed Edward Whitmore at the Beverly Hills mansion. During the conversation, Edward mentioned he'd been in conflict with his brother over Nathaniel's excessive spending. He also said his brother was starting to behave more and more like their father. Despite the tension in the conversation, Lee didn't push Edward and left without any concrete evidence. After the meeting, Edward tried calling Nathaniel in Princeton but couldn't reach him. He then called his psychotherapist, Dr. Jerome Weiss. From that point on, the case would take a decisive turn, one made possible thanks to the testimony of Craig Alden, a close friend of Edward's. On November 17th, Craig told detectives Lee Sorensen and Tim Callahan that 12 days after the murders, he had visited the Beverly Hills mansion. During that visit, Edward asked Craig if he wanted to know how the crime could have happened. That night, Edward reportedly told him, "Me and Nathaniel went back to the house to get a fake ID." According to Craig, after retrieving the document, while Edward was walking toward the car, Nathaniel appeared carrying 2 shotguns and said it was time to act. Craig described the plan as simple. Nathaniel would shoot Richard, and Edward would be responsible for killing Catherine. The details stunned investigators, especially when Craig revealed that Edward had described walking into the living room, where they found their father. Richard was shot by Nathaniel and tried to flee, but was killed shortly after. Edward said he couldn't bring himself to shoot his mother. When Catherine tried to escape, Nathaniel shot her. After she went down, Edward said he approached and fired 2 more shots. Despite the wealth of detail, investigators were troubled by the way Edward had framed it, asking Craig, "Do you want to know how the crime could have happened?" It sounded like an indirect confession, delivered as a hypothetical narrative, something that couldn't be used in court as is. Lee Sorensen and Tim Callahan brought the account to Assistant District Attorney Pam Ferris of Los Angeles County. Pam considered the testimony insufficient to file charges on its own, but recommended that Craig be used as an active part of the investigation. An attorney from her office suggested Craig wear a wire and try to get a direct confession out of Edward. Craig agreed. So, on November 29th, Craig had dinner with Edward at Gladstone's, a seafood restaurant in Malibu, Los Angeles. During the conversation, Edward denied any involvement in the murders and claimed he'd simply made up the story. For investigators, the meeting felt like a failure, but the prosecution saw his reaction as a sign the earlier account was likely true. From that point on, authorities turned their attention to finding the shotguns. Lee Sorensen requested a list from the Department of Justice of every store in Los Angeles County that sold that type of weapon. They received a list nearly 80 pages long. Given the sheer volume, investigators decided not to focus on tracking down the specific store, believing the brothers likely hadn't purchased the guns under their own names. As time passed, morale began to sink. The team worried the brothers would simply burn through their inheritance, free and clear, with no consequences. But the breakthrough came when a 47-year-old woman named Judith Carmona approached investigators with an unexpected revelation. Judith had been romantically involved with Edward's psychotherapist, Dr. Jerome Weiss. At one point, Jerome had shown her a tape recorded during a therapy session with the Whitmore brothers, dated late October 1989. Judith said that on the recording, she could hear Nathaniel screaming at Edward for having told the therapist everything. Nathaniel reportedly said they'd need to kill the therapist. Edward, crying, replied that he couldn't take another life. Judith also said she'd witnessed Nathaniel leaving Jerome's office after threatening him directly. Even so, Jerome continued the sessions with the brothers, claiming he might be able to help them understand what had driven them to commit the murders. Judith also said the shotguns used in the crime had been thrown into a canyon near Mulholland Drive. Searches of the area turned up nothing, and the weapons were never found. Even without the shotguns, the new information was enough for investigators to obtain a search warrant. On March 8, 1990, more than a year after the murders, Jerome was legally compelled to turn over 17 audio tapes and 7 pages of session notes. While still in his office, the therapist played some of the recordings, letting officers hear detailed confessions of the murders and explanations of the motives behind them. Afterward, the tapes and documents were sealed in an evidence bag and taken to the Los Angeles County Courthouse in Santa Monica. Legally, Nathaniel's death threat against Jerome was enough to break doctor-patient confidentiality. Still, all the evidence would need to be reviewed by the presiding judge, who would decide the next steps in the case against the Whitmore brothers. As the audio tapes were analyzed, the brothers' motivations began to come into focus. To really understand the context behind the murders, it helps to go back to the years before the crime. Based on accounts from family members, and later from the brothers themselves, it became clear that, from a very young age, Nathaniel and Edward lived under extremely rigid rules. Richard and Catherine controlled what they ate, what they read, even how they spent their free time. There was little to no consideration given to the fact that they were, at the end of the day, just children. As a result of that pressure, Nathaniel and Edward developed stutters, stomach pain, and teeth grinding, symptoms tied directly to the oppressive environment, driven mainly by Richard. Beyond being a strict father, Richard also humiliated his co-workers. Some sources noted he made deliberate efforts to appear more American, even asking to be called rich in professional settings. That authoritarian behavior created a strong emotional dependency between the two brothers. Nathaniel and Edward came to believe the only way they could survive their father was by staying united. Edward idolized his older brother. Close friends noticed the intensity of that attachment, which many considered unhealthy. In the late 1970s, while living near Princeton, New Jersey, the two brothers attended Princeton Day School. Nathaniel struggled academically from the start. He was distracted and immature. Edward followed the same pattern, and both boys had learning difficulties. Teachers noticed that homework brought in from home was noticeably better than the work they produced in class. It was widely believed that Richard and Catherine did their son's homework for them, which stunted Nathaniel and Edward's individual development. Another odd detail, even at nearly 15 years old, the two boys still played with stuffed animals. Richard, meanwhile, refused to admit his sons had any difficulties. He firmly believed in his own approach to parenting and used to quiz them at the dinner table with pointed questions. Over time, those questions grew increasingly elaborate. On one occasion, he demanded each son pick a different sport, insisting they not choose the same one, so as to avoid any appearance that the two boys were overly dependent on each other. Richard feared that if the boys collaborated too much, it might raise questions about his parenting. Even so, Nathaniel and Edward ignored the instruction and both chose tennis. In 1982, the first signs of disturbing behavior surfaced. That summer, their cousin, Diane Foster, spent a stretch of time staying with the Whitmore family. One night, while Sapan play wrestling, the brothers suddenly turned on Diane, tearing off part of her clothes. Then they tied her up and removed the rest. Frightened, Diane screamed, which made Nathaniel and Edward stop immediately, visibly confused by what they'd just done. Later, Nathaniel attacked Diane again, this time while they were watching TV. Without warning, he jumped on top of his cousin and began groping her chest. The attack only stopped when Diane fought back. Around the same time, Nathaniel began dating Stacy Coleman, the manager of the school's boys' tennis team. Teachers viewed the relationship positively, seeing the two as a good influence on each other. During their time together, Nathaniel gave Stacy jewelry and other expensive gifts. The couple even talked about marriage and building a life together. Over time, though, Stacy realized she still had a lot of living to do. When she was accepted into college, she decided to end the relationship. Nathaniel was devastated. He tried to win her back with a fur coat, even more expensive than his previous gifts. But Stacy refused and confirmed it was over. Afterward, Nathaniel tried to focus on his studies, even though he'd never actually enjoyed schoolwork. What he really wanted was to open a restaurant, skipping college altogether. His father, Richard, strongly disagreed. He dreamed of seeing his son at an Ivy League school, a goal that had once been his own and that he now projected onto Nathaniel. Even so, Richard knew his son had never had the academic performance needed to reach that goal. In 1986, Nathaniel applied to Princeton and was rejected. After the denial, he enrolled at a local college and reapplied to Princeton. While waiting for a response, he met a waitress named Jamie Prescott. The relationship was frowned upon by Richard and Catherine, who believed Jamie was only interested in Nathaniel for financial reasons. Despite the criticism, Nathaniel was accepted into Princeton at 19. Around the same time, though, he also proposed to Jamie, which infuriated Richard. Determined to end the relationship, Richard used the fact that Jamie also worked as a tennis instructor. During a business trip to Alabama, she received a sponsorship offer from a European company, one that Richard himself had quietly arranged, requiring her to relocate to another country. Even so, Nathaniel followed his fiancée to Europe, neglecting his studies at Princeton. After returning, Nathaniel signed Princeton's Honor Code, a formal commitment to conduct required of all students, but he didn't take it seriously. During his first semester, he was accused of plagiarism after copying a classmate's assignment for a psychology course and submitting it as his own work. Upon discovering the violation, Richard drafted a statement on ethics to be submitted to the university's disciplinary committee. Even so, during the hearing, Nathaniel was found guilty and suspended from Princeton for a full year. Richard tried to challenge the university's ruling, arguing the suspension was excessive, since Nathaniel had only plagiarized a minor assignment, not a major piece of work. The committee disagreed and upheld the suspension. With his son now out of school, Richard decided to bring him on to work at Cinema Global Entertainment. At the company, Nathaniel was put in charge of reviewing expense reports and suggesting ways to cut operational costs. During this time, Nathaniel noticed just how afraid the employees were of his father. Meetings with Richard required scheduling in advance, and any reprimand happened publicly, never in private. That made Nathaniel feel suffocated by being the son of one of the most feared men in the company. Co-workers, however, described Nathaniel's own behavior as unpleasant, arrogant, and self-centered. On warm days, he'd skip work without notice to go play tennis. After a few months, Richard learned about this pattern and fired his own son. In the fall of 1988, Nathaniel returned to Princeton, but grew irritated upon discovering he'd been assigned a roommate. Previously, he'd had a single room, even though it was smaller. Unhappy, he threw his new roommate's belongings out into the hallway. Once again, Richard stepped in and wrote a letter to the university, securing another single room for his son. Around this time, Nathaniel ended things with Jamie, but started a new relationship in the spring of 1989, this time with Christine, a 30-year-old model. The new relationship bothered Richard and Catherine, who saw the age gap, with her being older, as a problem. Shortly after, the couple discovered Nathaniel had also grown to hate Princeton and wanted to transfer schools. Richard was firm and forced him to stay. Meanwhile, Edward was growing up in his brother's shadow, but with behavior that was, if anything, even more unusual. After finishing high school, he began raising concerns for his parents. Catherine started to suspect her son might be gay and pressured him to start dating a girl. When Edward finally did begin a relationship, his behavior became troubling. During one argument, he locked his girlfriend in a bedroom for a long stretch of time. The young woman screamed until she was finally able to get out. She later said Edward was the strangest man she'd ever met, describing him as arrogant, insecure, and emotionally unstable. After that relationship ended, Edward dated Janice, a wealthy young woman. But Edward's strongest bond, by far, was with Craig Alden, a former classmate who would later become one of the key sources in the case. During the investigation into the brothers' past, it came out that in July 1988, Nathaniel and Edward had broken into the homes of several friends. Over the course of roughly a year, They'd stolen approximately $100,000 worth of property. The case was investigated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. The connection came to light when Edward was pulled over for a traffic violation, and police found a stolen item in the car. Richard was furious. He hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney he knew, Gerald Chapman. The defense negotiated a deal with the prosecutor in which Edward would take full responsibility for the crimes, clearing Nathaniel of any charges. Edward was sentenced to community service. On top of that, both brothers were required to begin mandatory therapy sessions. Following the burglaries, the family, then living in Calabasas, accepted a new job, opportunity for Richard, and relocated to Beverly Hills, California. Later on, once investigators connected the brothers to their parents' murder, they also linked them to the earlier string of residential burglaries. But since the double homicide took priority, they ultimately dropped the burglary investigation altogether. On March 8, 1990, the board of directors at Cinema Global Entertainment was informed, through a law firm, that Nathaniel and Edward would soon be arrested by Beverly Hills police. Everyone knew about the impending arrest. Everyone except the brothers themselves. Authorities had planned to capture both of them together, but Edward had traveled to Israel to compete in a tennis tournament. Police then focused on Nathaniel, who was at the family mansion. Officers decided not to enter the residence directly, since Richard's mother, Elena Whitmore, was inside and could potentially be used as a shield. Instead, they chose to wait for Nathaniel to leave on his own. Early in the afternoon, he left the house with two friends to have lunch at the Cheesecake Factory. Driving off in a Jeep, Nathaniel spotted a blue car parked on the street and deliberately hit it. As he threw the car into reverse, he collided with a police van that had blocked the exit. All three occupants of the vehicle were handcuffed and taken to the sheriff's station in West Hollywood. Nathaniel was charged with the murder of his parents and transferred to the Los Angeles County Men's Central Jail downtown. Upon learning of his brother's arrest, Edward called one of his uncles, who advised him to turn himself in. Authorities feared he might try to flee, but relatives assured them Edward was emotionally dependent on Nathaniel and would follow his lead to the end. On March 11th, detectives Lee Sorensen and Tim Callahan personally waited for Edward's arrival at Los Angeles International Airport to make the arrest. During the press conference that followed, District Attorney Ira Reynolds stated that the motive behind the crime was greed. He added that, if convicted, the brothers would face the death penalty in San Quentin's gas chamber. The case, one of the most sensational of the late 1980s, shocked the public because of the stark contrast between the brutality of the crime and the lifestyle of the family involved. Nathaniel and Edward had access to everything. Yet, for reasons that remained unclear, nothing ever seemed to be enough, and that void, in the end, culminated in the murder of their parents and the end of both brothers' freedom. Although the arrest of the Whitmore brothers had shocked the public, the Beverly Hills Police Department still didn't have solid proof directly linking Nathaniel and Edward to the murders. Under pressure, detectives Lee Sorensen and Tim Callahan intensified their search for any piece of evidence, especially regarding the origin of the shotguns. Based on Judith Carmona's testimony, who claimed the weapons had been thrown away in a canyon, a new theory emerged, that the guns had actually been purchased in San Diego. The investigation began with an extensive list of gun stores. Their first stop was a small shop near the highway connecting Los Angeles to San Diego. Nothing turned up. Lee Sorensen then tried smaller stores, again without success. The new strategy was to focus on discount retailers. That's how they eventually landed on a Big Five store on Convoy Street. There, they found a record of the sale of two 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns, each sold for $119.95. The purchase had been made on August 18, 1989, signed under the name Devin J. Goodrow, with an address listed in San Diego. The address turned out to be fake, but the driver's license number on the form belonged to a real person, Devin. Once located by investigators, Devin proved he'd actually been in New York on the day of the purchase, managing a restaurant. When shown the form, Devin said he didn't recognize the signature and revealed his driver's license had gone missing. Based on that, the prosecution requested handwriting analysis to compare Nathaniel's and Edward's writing to the signature on the form. Edward refused. Nathaniel agreed. Investigators later discovered Nathaniel and Devin had briefly attended college together, making it entirely plausible that Nathaniel had stolen the document from him. With the case gaining real traction, the family hired one of the best defense attorneys available, Louise Abernathy. Small in stature, Louise was known for her sharp tongue and combative courtroom presence. At the time, her reputation was so formidable that many judges didn't relish the idea of facing her in their courtroom. Taking on the defense of Nathaniel and Edward, Louise Abernathy brought a resume that included 14 high-profile homicide cases in which only a single client had ever received the death penalty. However shocking the facts of this case were, Louise was determined to prevent the brothers from being sentenced to death. On March 26, 1990, the first hearing took place at the Beverly Hills Municipal Court. There, Nathaniel and Edward Whitmore stood before Judge Judith Klein. As they walked into the courtroom, Nathaniel and Edward smiled and waved to friends and family, acting as though the defense would wrap everything up quickly. Judge Judith noticed the brothers' arrogance and made no effort to hide her distaste for their casual, almost playful attitude. At one point, she demanded both of them stand up and look directly at her. Nathaniel and Edward barely managed to suppress their laughter. Over the following months, while the trial itself had yet to begin, the Santa Monica Superior Court reviewed the question of doctor-patient confidentiality between the brothers and their therapist, Dr. Jerome Weiss. Judge James Alcott ruled that 3 of the audio tapes should be handed over to the prosecutor's office. In one recording, dated December 11, 1989, the brothers could be heard discussing sacred details of the murder. That tape would become the prosecution's central piece of evidence. Other recordings revealed that Nathaniel and Edward had watched a miniseries called The Billionaire Boys Club, which aired on July 30th and 31st, 1989, depicting young men from Beverly Hills involved in 2 murders, including that of one member's own father. The similarities to the real case drew significant attention. The brothers denied any influence from the show, but the coincidence sparked debate. Legal disputes over the content of the tapes caused further delays in the trial. It wasn't until June 1992 that the California Supreme Court blocked the release of the key recording. By that point, Nathaniel and Edward had already spent 3 years in Los Angeles County custody, awaiting trial. In December of that same year, the county grand jury formally indicted both brothers on murder charges. The first trial was set for July 1993 at the Los Angeles County Superior Court, presided over by Judge Stanley Weisberg. Right from the start, defense attorney Louise Abernathy laid out her theory to the jury. The true guilty parties were the victims themselves, Richard and Catherine. According to the defense, Nathaniel and Edward had lived for years under constant fear, driven by psychological and physical abuse, primarily from Richard. The defense portrayed the brothers as wealthy, athletic, spoiled sons who, at one point, had dreamed of professional tennis careers, but who were in reality emotionally shattered by the abuse they'd suffered inside their own home. The prosecution was caught off guard. Up to that point, the brothers had never once mentioned any kind of abuse. Louise presented the abuse allegations without submitting any medical records or photographs as supporting evidence. Even so, the prosecution understood the strategy was to construct an emotional narrative for the jury. That strategy was clear from the very first day of the trial, when Nathaniel and Edward showed up in court wearing childish sweaters, sporty shirts, and khaki pants, an attempt to appear more like adolescents of 12 and 15 rather than grown men of 25 and 22. The defense wanted to convince the jury the brothers had simply never matured emotionally. Throughout the trial, Louise reinforced that image by treating them like children. She was seen adjusting their sweaters, resting a hand on each of their shoulders, the way a mother might with young sons. The message was clear. Louise, wasn't there defending murderers? She was defending two misunderstood young men. The prosecution found the display unsettling, but they came armed with a substantial body of evidence. Prosecutor Pamela Boswell opened her case by describing the sheer brutality of the murders. According to her, Richard and Catherine had simply been sitting peacefully in the living room when their sons appeared out of nowhere and executed them in cold blood. Pamela emphasized that Nathaniel and Edward were habitual liars who would do anything to avoid prison, including, in her view, fabricating a story of childhood abuse to escape the death penalty. Pamela also highlighted the brothers' extravagant spending in the immediate aftermath of the murders, buying expensive, frivolous items without a shred of remorse. The defense insisted the jury needed to understand the motivation behind the killings. Their argument was that everything began when Edward confided in Nathaniel that he'd been sexually abused by Richard for 12 years. The revelation, they claimed, had shaken Nathaniel to his core. He confronted their father, telling him the abuse would stop. Richard reportedly responded that he'd do whatever he wanted with his own son, and that he wouldn't tolerate threats. Shortly after, the brothers allegedly traveled to San Diego and bought 2 shotguns, using Devin Goodrow's driver's license. As for why the abuse had never come out before, the defense claimed Edward carried deep shame about it, though he had, at some point, shared it with a few family members. The prosecution disagreed, arguing the revelation was simply too convenient. In their view, the brothers had rehearsed the abuse narrative before sharing it with relatives, who would later be called as defense witnesses. During the first phase of the trial, the prosecution called 26 witnesses, ranging from Nathaniel's former bodyguards to the store clerk at Big Five, who'd sold the shotguns to Edward. Even with these smaller testimonies, the prosecution's goal was to show that, taken together, all these accounts pointed to the same conclusion. Nathaniel and Edward were compulsive liars. In the trial's early days, the jury heard Nathaniel's original 911 call. According to prosecutor Pamela Boswell, the content of the call revealed just how skilled an actor Nathaniel truly was. Investigator Lee Sorensen also testified. He recounted that just hours after the murders, the brothers had returned to the mansion and asked officers if they could retrieve their tennis rackets. To the prosecution, that behavior was cold and calculated. At the time, officers had denied the request, since the medical examiner was still examining Richard and Catherine's bodies. Next, a firearms expert demonstrated how the 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun operated. The expert explained that firing multiple shots required the shooter to pull the trigger and perform 2 separate manual actions between each shot, something that demanded focus and clear intent. The prosecution's goal was to prove the crime had been premeditated, not some impulsive act. Another powerful testimony came from psychotherapist Dr. Jerome Weiss. He recounted that Nathaniel and Edward had wanted to kill their parents because they felt dominated and belittled by Richard's controlling personality. Catherine, he said, was killed because the brothers didn't want to leave any witnesses alive. The prosecution wanted Jerome to describe the brothers as sociopaths, but the defense successfully blocked the use of that term, arguing it was overly loaded and potentially prejudicial to the jury. The defense, for its part, doubled down on the theory that the killings had occurred out of imminent danger. Under California law, that claim could lead to an acquittal or a reduced sentence, provided 2 conditions were proven: that the brothers genuinely feared for their lives, and that any reasonable person in their position would have felt the same way. When Edward testified, he stated he believed his parents were planning to kill him. He also claimed Catherine exercised an almost supernatural level of control over his life, knowing where he was, who he was talking to, and what he was doing at all times. His statements came across as childlike, exactly the effect the defense had hoped for, aiming to show just how emotionally infantilized the brothers had become. Edward also described the sexual abuse he said he'd endured over the years. In one particularly striking moment, he revealed that he had started putting cinnamon in his father's tea and coffee, after hearing from friends that it could change the taste of semen. After long weeks of trial, the jury began deliberations at the end of 1993. On January 13, 1994, after 16 days, the jurors announced they were deadlocked, unable to reach a consensus on the charges. As a result, the proceedings dragged on. By the end of January, the jury declared another impasse, unable to decide whether the Whitmore brothers were murderers or victims of years of abuse. The judge ultimately declared a mistrial. In August 1994, a new trial began. This time, the prosecution came far better prepared, arguing that Nathaniel and Edward had executed their parents and then shot them in the legs to stage the scene as a mob hit. Expert Roger McKay of Failure Analysis Associates reconstructed the murders shot by shot, presenting the jury with a computer-generated animation. According to the prosecution's account, the brothers entered through the office door and walked toward the living room at the back of the house, lit only by the glow of the television. Richard was dozing on the beige sofa, seated at the end nearest the hallway. His legs were stretched out, feet resting on the coffee table, beside 2 plates with leftover berries and ice cream. Catherine was lying beneath a blanket, her head resting in Richard's lap. One of the brothers raised the shotgun toward the couple and fired. 2 shots struck Richard. One shattered glass and splintered wood on the French doors behind the sofa. One round hit his left elbow, another his right arm. Then, another shot. He was left immobilized by the wounds. One of the brothers then moved behind the sofa, pressed the shotgun to the back of his father's neck, and fired. The blast tore open the back of Richard's head. He slumped over dead on the sofa, tilted to the right, hands resting on his stomach, feet still on the floor. With the first shots, Catherine woke up, covered in her husband's blood and tissue. Terrified, she tried to flee, but only managed a few steps before being struck in the right leg and right arm. She fell between the sofa and the coffee table. She tried to get back up, slipped in her own blood, and stumbled for a few seconds, just long enough for blood to run down her leg. As she tried to escape, another shot brought her down. Once on the ground, she was struck by several more rounds. A point-blank shot to the left thigh shattered the bone from the impact of the pellets and the wadding surrounding them. Other shots struck her right arms and left chest, puncturing her left lung. More than a liter of blood pooled into her chest cavity. Even so, Catherine was still breathing and tried to crawl, but couldn't manage to move. At that point, the Whitmore brothers were out of ammunition. They paused, uncertain. They likely wondered whether Catherine could still identify them to the police. They decided they couldn't take that risk. They ran to the car, grabbed more ammunition, and reloaded the shotguns with heavier buckshot, different from the smaller pellets they'd used before. Only one of the brothers went back into the room, where Catherine lay dying. He leaned over the coffee table, pressed the shotgun to her left cheek, and fired. Catherine's body was struck 10 times in total. 4 shots hit her head, completely destroying her skull. Afterward, the brothers fired into their own knees and carefully collected the spent shells from the blood-stained floor. That was the scenario laid out by authorities. A cold, premeditated crime. On February 16th, the judge ruled there was no evidence Nathaniel and Edward had been in any imminent danger when they killed their parents. With that ruling, the jury was able to proceed with deliberations. Both brothers were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury also found 2 aggravating circumstances: lying in wait and multiple murder. Given those aggravating factors, 2 sentencing options remained: life in prison without parole or the death penalty. On April 17, 1996, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury chose life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was justified by the fact that Nathaniel and Edward had no prior criminal record and no history of violence. Both were sent to North Kern State Prison in Delano, where they would undergo diagnostic evaluations. The court would later determine whether they could serve their sentences together or would need to be separated. On September 10, 1996, the California Department of Corrections decided to separate them. Nathaniel was transferred to the California Correctional Institution, and Edward to a state prison near Sacramento. Both were classified as maximum security inmates and kept in isolation. Defense attorney Louise Abernathy opposed the separation, calling it cruel and punitive. In 1999, she filed habeas corpus petitions, all of which were denied by the California Supreme Court. The defense then appealed to the U.S. District Court, which rejected the petitions in 2003. In 2005, the Court of Appeals upheld that decision. During the early years of his confinement, Nathaniel spent much of his time on the phone. He would talk regularly with the manager of his old diner, which drew complaints from other inmates about how long his calls ran. Edward, meanwhile, was caught in an intimate moment with a fellow inmate, though the incident wasn't repeated. On April 4, 2018, a new development emerged. Nathaniel was transferred to the same housing unit as Edward, and the two brothers were reunited after 22 years apart. Around the same time, the brothers' current attorneys, Michael Grayson and Cliff Barden, filed a new habeas corpus petition, this time backed by new evidence. One piece was a letter Edward had written months before the murders, addressed to his cousin Andy Reyes. In it, Edward expressed deep disgust toward his father, referencing the abuse and criticizing the fact that Richard had gained weight, which, in his words, only made everything feel more suffocating. The attorneys also included testimony from Ray Rossello, who claimed he too had been sexually abused by Richard Whitmore. With the new habeas corpus petition accepted, the current Los Angeles County District Attorney, George Gascon, recommended a resentencing for the brothers, a move that could make them eligible for parole. The news spread quickly across social media, especially after a prominent celebrity commented online that the Whitmore brothers were finally getting a second chance at life. That same celebrity has become known for speaking out on criminal justice issues in the United States, particularly cases involving abuse and wrongful punishment. She has said that, at the time of the original trial, not enough attention was given to the lasting effects of the abuse both brothers suffered at Richard Whitmore's hands. As of now, Nathaniel Whitmore is 57 years old, having spent 35 of those years behind bars. Edward is 54. Public reaction to the news has been largely neutral. Most people seem content to simply wait and see how things unfold. Much of that neutrality reflects the broader way American society has processed the story over the decades. The Whitmore family remains hopeful, believing there's no longer any real purpose in keeping the brothers locked up, though, in the end, that's a decision only the justice system can make. And